Our next presentations will be from Lou Jost and Marco Monteros from Fundación EcoMinga, the EcoMinga Foundation based in Ecuador. Just a brief introduction to Lou and Marco. Lou began to grow orchids when he was 12 years old and subsequently studied physics and math, but was always dreaming about tropical biodiversity and began eventually to work as a guide and nature photographer in Mexico, Costa Rica, and eventually Ecuador. He finally moved to Ecuador in 1994, and as he explored the Ecuadorian Andes, began to discover many new species of orchids, most in areas that were not protected by national parks or reserves. Eventually, his friends and he felt a responsibility to protect the things they'd discovered. So in 2006, they formed the EcoMinga Foundation to begin building larger reserves and protect strategic biodiversity hotspots. This work continues, and he'll be talking about those efforts today. He's also worked on mathematics for describing biodiversity and genetic diversity, and on the statistics of fossil dates that are used to calibrate some of the molecular phylogenies that Tom talked about a little bit earlier. Marco Monteros is an environmental engineer and an EcoMinga Foundation member, and also a member of the Reserve Youth Council and the Reserva Youth Land Trust. As a member of the EcoMinga Foundation, he works on the technical and scientific aspects of orchid conservation and research in the cloud forest of northwestern Ecuador. So with that, I will stop sharing and turn it over to Lou and Marco.
Thanks, Ron, for the introduction, and thank you all for coming. And thanks, Tom, for that fascinating and thought-provoking talk. A lot of what I'll be saying in my talk reinforces the ideas that he presented about patterns of diversity and speciation and priorities for conservation. So you surely noticed that all three of the presenting organizations are from South America, and we're all from the Andes. And Tom explained why that is. The Andes are one of the world's hotspots for orchid diversity, but that's not just true for orchids, that's true for plants in general. Tropical Latin America has about twice as many plant species as the tropics of Asia and Africa combined. And so for all plants, the Latin America is where it's at in terms of conservation needs and conservation priorities. And for orchids, as Tom explained, it's the northern Andes that are the real hotspots globally. So that's why there are three of us here from the northern Andes. Slides are not advancing, Ron.
You probably have to click in the area where your presentation is, and then it'll allow you to advance.
Thank you. No. Okay. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about how EcoMinga got started, and that'll help you understand what we do and why we do what we do. I live in Baños on the eastern edge of the Andes, facing the Amazon basin, and it's a very special place. This is the town of Baños. The surroundings are completely deforested, but you don't have to go very far to get excellent cloud forest. And I've been particularly interested in the genus Lepanthes. This is one of the biggest plant genera in the world, and also one with an extraordinarily high percentage of locally endemic species. So this makes them interesting tools for studying biogeography and local biogeographic patterns, and also makes them excellent guides for conservation, for prioritizing different areas. You all know probably that Lepanthes are tiny orchids often with hidden flowers under the leaves, and it's marvelous. It was tremendously exciting for me to walk through these forests in the Andes and see a Lepanthes plant and turn over the leaf and discover some amazing, beautiful color combination and intricate structures. So initially my interest was just purely aesthetic. But then I started finding these just tremendously beautiful plants. And they started to be, some of them were new to science, like this one. This is one of the earlier species that I discovered. So that made me aware that perhaps this area where I was living was not as well studied as I had thought, and that there might be some interesting biodiversity here. And I got absorbed by it and walked for the next 20 years. I walked all these mountains and mapped the distributions of all these Lepanthes. And I found very strong patterns of distribution. These weren't just randomly scattered among the mountains in the valley where I lived. Oops. So here's Baños. I think you can see my pointer. Here's the volcano that I live on right now, right about there. And here's the Amazon, the lowland rainforest. This is a dry Andean, interandean plateau. And the orchids generally, especially the Lepanthes, had very distinct patterns. They were shared between mountains in a north-south direction, but typically were very different from each other in the east-west direction. The mountains, this mountain, for example, shared very few Lepanthes species with this mountain. And it wasn't just a matter of distance or isolation by dispersal barriers. It's actually easier to move from this mountain to this mountain than it is to move from this mountain to the mountain across the deep valley of the Rio Pastaza, which contains unsuitable habitat for Lepanthes. Yet it was the easy direction that was not taken, and the hard direction was taken typically for these Lepanthes species. So that raised a lot of interesting questions. The differences are striking between, here's one mountain with a lot of Lepanthes, another mountain with a lot of Lepanthes, and they only shared a tiny fraction of the number of species contained by either mountain. That's surprising because orchids have dust-like seeds. They're probably the best, amongst the best dispersing seeds of any flowering plants. And so surely the seeds were going from one mountain to the next, but they weren't growing there for some reason. And this is true generally for orchids in Ecuador. The plant family with the largest percentage of endemic species is the orchids. Endemic means strictly growing in just Ecuador, nowhere else in the world. These are the ones that are of great conservation importance. And you can see that the other families practically don't even rate compared to the orchids. And it should be, you might think if dispersal limitation causes endemism, it should just be the reverse, that the larger seeded plants should have the most endemism and the orchids should have the least. But it turns out that looking at the distributions on the ground, orchids are following a climate gradient here. My valley, the Rio Pastaza watershed, has the sharpest rainfall gradient in all of Ecuador. So the mountains on the east are getting a lot of rain, and the mountains on the west are getting less. And orchids seem to be specializing in these particular differences, these tiny differences in rainfall and mist from one neighboring mountain to the other. And this is what seems to be controlling their distribution. And they can reach other mountains, but they apparently can't grow there because the microclimates aren't right. So this teaches us something about how to choose our conservation sites and provide some interesting insights in how to find new species. We need to look at local microclimates. And the same orchids can be present on very distant mountains when they have the same microclimates. It's shocking sometimes to find like I had the experience of discovering a new Lepanthes in my area in the Pasasa watershed, and then later hundreds of miles away finding the same species on another mountain at about the same elevation and the same exposure, and apparently no one's ever found them in between. So microclimates rather than dispersal limitations seem to control most orchid distributions in Ecuador. And the Lepanthes were just the tip of the iceberg when it came to new species in my area. I discovered many other genera, new species in other genera, like the Sandinia, a new Dracula, beautiful new Dracula that's still not described yet. But it's a close relative of the Dracula exasperata in Sibundoy, which Martha will talk about. New Pantheva, lots and lots of new orchids. I don't have time to talk about them, but just to give you the idea that this valley turned out to be full of orchids. Once I started looking carefully mountain for mountain at these special climate, special microclimates. And among my favorite local endemics in the area, though it's not one I discovered, is Tegia Zeus, a pleurophthalid with flowers about 4 inches tall on a very small plant, a spectacular and strange flower with lots of intricate structures. We still know nothing about almost nothing about what pollinates these. Still waiting for someone to figure that out, although we have some clues. Amazing structures. My favorite discovery in this whole process of walking these mountains and trying to figure out where the orchids are was a discovery of these strange orchid leaves in the understory on the ground with odd flowers. I couldn't recognize the leaves at all when I first found them in 2001 or 2002. But I learned later from Carl Luhr that these were new subgenus, apparently, of the genus Tegia, the same genus as the Tegia Zeus that I just showed you. But these weren't very morphologically similar. They're long creeping plants with successive flowers. And in the first place where I found them, I found 4 new species in 1 square meter of moss. There was this one, that's the same one, this one, and this one, which came in 2 nice colors. And this is the same species. Remarkable variation, amazing discovery in 1 square meter of moss. And it got me to think, well, gosh, look at all these mountains that nobody's ever been to. These were high, these Tegias were found at about 3,000 meters and above, so very high. And there were all these unexplored peaks around Baños, which could have more of those. So my students and I spent the next couple of years exploring these different remote mountains, and we kept finding new species on every mountain. This one, which Kelsey Huisman, who's in the audience today, discovered just last year. So they're still coming. This is an alcohol specimen of it. This one. Really seemingly an endless supply of locally endemic species that are unique to this area. So the highest possible conservation priority. I can't imagine a higher conservation priority than a place that's globally as unique as this and as scientifically interesting as this, because this watershed has more to teach us about speciation than almost any other place. It's truly an astonishing number of Tegia species on the tops of these mountains. This is a partial family portrait of them. And one of the weird things is that the species to the north of the Rio Pastaza are completely different from the species to the south of the Rio Pastaza. And the other weird thing was that on some peaks, there were up to 15 or 16 species of these new Tigia growing together sympatrically. So DNA showed that they are the new Tigias. Here's the previously known Tigias, and the new ones are here. They're in their own branch of the Tigia phylogeny. So they apparently all evolved here. They didn't blow in from individually from other distant places. They all evolved here in the Rio Pastaza watershed. And they did this in the last 2.5 million years, which is very fast for a plant radiation of this magnitude. This is much more interesting scientifically than the Galapagos finches, which are so easy to understand their evolution and their speciation because they're growing on, they're living on different islands, well separated from each other. Easy to understand how that could happen. Much harder to understand how you could get 15 close relatives growing on the same mountain in the same place. And after adding up all the new species that scientists have discovered in my valley, in this small valley, it turns out that there's 190 species of plants. Someone has a dentist. Can someone read? Mega.
Should be good to go, Lou. You're muted though. You'll need to unmute.
Okay, thank you. So my little valley has more locally endemic species of plants than the Galapagos Islands. I can hardly think of hardly imagine a stronger argument for focusing conservation efforts on an area like this. Unfortunately, of course, deforestation is happening very rapidly in the Andes. And my friends and I, as Ron mentioned, my friends and I saw this and realized that we would have to do something to protect these local hotspots of endemism that we had discovered. And so we formed the foundation, EcoMinga Foundation, Fundación EcoMinga, and began to try to raise money internationally to buy these special areas that we had uncovered. And so right now we have a reserve system in the Baños area, which connects the high elevation national parks in the area, outlined in green here, extends their protection to the lower mid-elevation cloud forests, which are the real high diversity habitats in the area. So we've done this in each of the separate lines of mountains that I mapped. So each of these sets of reserves, even though they're close together, have different species. And we've also connected the two national parks to each other, providing additional ecosystem sustainability. We also created reserves in similar areas in other parts of Ecuador eventually, including Manduriacu Reserve here in Imbabura province and Dracula Reserve here near the Colombian border. Marco will talk about this Dracula Reserve as soon as I finish. As Tom mentioned, we're very conscious of the fact that we have to include elevational gradients in the design of our reserves. So, for example, this major reserve starts at 1,500 meters and goes up to 38, 60 meters. That's an elevation change of a mile, over a mile between the bottom and the top. So there is room for plants to creep up this mountain as climate changes, as it inevitably will become hotter in our area. I'd like to say something briefly about climate change, though. A lot of people, there have been studies that paint a very gloomy picture for the future, and it suggests the question, well, why should we bother to conserve at all if we're going to lose all this in the next century? And the answer is to take a larger view of climate change in the past. And if you look on a scale of hundreds of thousands of years, the plants that are here now have been through bigger changes than what we expect in the next, say, century. In the very recent past, a few tens of thousands of years ago, the temperatures were much higher than they are now. And elevation bands of vegetation in the Andes had risen 500 meters above where they are now. And everything that's alive today, except for the very most recently evolved species, has been through that and could possibly go through it again without becoming extinct if we can maintain connectivity and gradients of elevation so that things can move. So I don't know what's going to happen in 1,000 years. Probably we will be in trouble then. But in the near future, there's reason to be a little less depressed than the media and some scientific studies suggest. So I'd like to say briefly that emphasize that buying land's not enough, and it's important to have crews of people who are protecting and studying the land. This is a set of our park guards who are actually, many of them are the landowners of people who we bought the land from. They're the very best people to protect the land, and they've become great parabiologists. They know their forest very well and often discover new species on their own. We also are working hard to teach the little kids in the communities around us about the forests around them. And we try to involve the communities economically in the health of our reserves by doing community tourism, using our reserves as a resource for the local community to run tourism. And we've also, for example, with the help of the Orchid Conservation Alliance and the Rainforest Trust and World Land Trust, we've helped during the COVID crisis, helped feed our community neighbors. I have very little time, but I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour of just some of the things that are in just one of our reserves, so you get an idea of the great diversity of things we're protecting, not just orchids. Have to emphasize that conservation is not just about orchids. We use orchids as a guide to figure out where we need to conserve, but almost inevitably, these orchids are indicators of more general hotspots of endemism, of frogs, of trees, of many other organisms. So here's a whirlwind tour of the Rio Zuniac Reserve. We have a scientific station which has helped us study and discover a lot of the things there. And there's new Sorelias, new Maxillarias. Here's an endemic Masdevallia. New trees. The biggest trees in the forest were unknown to science. This is a magnolia tree, a new magnolia tree. A few hundred meters higher up, another different new magnolia species was discovered. Fantastic Mariania melastome species, some of the most spectacular trees in the world, new to science. Another Mariania, also new to science. Another Mariania growing next to our cabin, new to science. This was just described. Beautiful plants. Fantastic insects, fantastic snakes, many new species of frogs, weird amphibians, threatened wildlife like the spectacled bear who came to visit us for dinner one day. Mountain tapirs, extremely endangered. Monkeys, which are now completely tame because we've protected them for 10 years. The guards who took this picture climbed the tree that the monkey was in to take this picture, and the monkey just sat there. But he better not sit too long because we have giant eagles that kill these monkeys, can eat them and carry them through the air. This is an adult. It's breeding in our reserves. And this wasn't in the Zuniac, but I have to include it as one of our most recent and most exciting new discoveries. Big, fantastic, neurotoxic frog on our Rio Machai reserve. Amazing discovery made by one of our park guides. And as I said, we also have 2 other reserves outside of the Baños area. Again, I'm just going to fly through them because there's no time, but our Manduriacu Reserve is producing new species of frogs, multiple new species of frogs every year. This glass frog, Nymphargus manduriacu. This is the only place in the world that has this glass frog, a new species of magnolia discovered there as well. And the Dracula Reserve, which Marco is going to talk about, is in an area of extreme high deforestation with extraordinarily rare orchids. It's the only place in Ecuador where Phragmipedium fisheri grows. And there's Phragmipedium hertzii, other rarities, mini Draculas, of course, Dracula terborkii, which hadn't been known in the wild. It was discovered in a cultivated plant in Europe. Another new species of Dracula, rare species of Dracula. We were helped considerably by our local Dracula expert, Luis Baquero, who helped us set up the reserve. Fantastic Lepanthes there too, lots of new ones, lots of old ones that are pretty cool. Poroglossum edwardiae, beautiful other orchids, and fascinating other plants. That is the source area for the most valuable commercial ornamental plant in the world, the Anthurium andreanum. And of course, the extremely rare frogs that are found only in that reserve and nowhere else in the world. And of course, cool birds. And this reserve was, I should shout out the Orchid Conservation Alliance for helping us start this reserve, along with the University of Basel Botanical Gardens and Rainforest Trust. And the Orchid Conservation Alliance has led trips to this reserve, and any listeners who want to go on their trips should strongly consider them. They're exciting and wonderful trips. So I'd like to end here just thanking our many donors who have helped us build this mosaic of reserves in the most special hotspots of orchid endemism in Ecuador. And I think we'll have Marco next, and then both Marco and I will take questions together after Marco is done. So thank you.
Thank you. If you can stop sharing, then I think we'll have Marco share his screen and we can go from there.
Hello, you can see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this symposium. I'm going to talk about the orchid conservation in Northwest Ecuador, in Dracula and Rio Manduriacu Reserve. Dracula and Rio Manduriacu Reserve are on northwestern Ecuador, in the western range of Ecuadorian Andes. On the one hand, Dracula Reserve is in Carchi province, and the Manduriacu Reserve is in Imbabura province. Both reserves are in tropical Andes, the most biodiverse and endangered hotspot of the world. And these reserves are influenced by other important biodiverse and endangered hotspots known as Tumbes Chocó Magdalena. The amazing there is that Dracula and Manduriaco Reserve has been recorded representative species of these two hotspots. The principal ecosystem in both reserves are cloud and tropical and subtropical forests with important rivers like the Pailon River in Dracula Reserve and the Rio Manduriaco and the Manduriaco River in Manduriaco. This is why the last reserve bears the name, while Dracula Reserve named in honor of the orchid genus because in this reserve has been recorded high diversity of species of Dracula genus. Some dates about the work. Dracula and Rio Manduriaco Reserve are protected almost 3,000 hectares in northwest Ecuador. We protected almost 80 endangered species between plants and animals. And we as well work with communities and local institutions to develop conservation strategies. For example, the team of Dracula Reserve worked with the local government of Tulcan. We delivered humanitarian aid to our indigenous communities during the pandemic. In the case of Manduriaco Reserve, the team worked there with the community of Manduriaco and the Education Ministry. Just to say some action, we set up a computer center to help the children to continue their virtual education during the pandemic, because in this community, the families didn't have an internet connection. Also, we work with environmental education and scientific investigation to understand and know the incredible biodiversity and complex ecosystem that we have in our reserves. In Dracula Reserve, we protected the unique natural population of Fragmipedium fishery. UCN considered this species as critical and critically endangered. We are monitoring this population to evaluate its conservation state. We registered no more than 100 individuals. I think that we need more exploration around the unique locality to Fragmipedium fishery to find a new populations. We have been exploring the Dracula during the last 5 years, and we can register almost 400 orchid species. Besides, we found and described some new species of orchids like Scaphocephalum luane, Chlorotalis chicalensis, Pseudolepanthes vihua, and Lepanthes tulcanensis. Pseudolepanthes vihua is the first record of Pseudolepanthes genus in Northwest and in Ecuador. Is very interesting and very beautiful. In Manduriaco Reserve, we began exploring 3 years ago, and we have already registered almost 90 orchid species. The Dracula and Manduriaco reserves are geographically close, although they share very few species. However, they may be geographical barriers that generate endemism. For example, the Mira River is considered a biogeographical barrier for some taxonomic groups, like examples, Lu. In the region, especially the tropical Andes of Ecuador is threatened mainly by deforestation, illegal extraction of species. Unfortunately, our rangers found a person taking orchids out of a sector of the Dracula Reserve, and we reported to the environmental authorities so that they could take legal action according to the environmental laws. And the mining is other threatened in this region. The mining is the great threat to Northwest Ecuador. Approximately 80% of this region is concessioned for metal mining. In the last month, the Dracula Reserve has been the most affected by this activity. With the ranger team of Dracula Reserve, we have registered mining exploration activities in the limits of the reserve. We have been able to observe affectation mainly in streams. If the mining project continues in this region, many species and ecosystems will be significantly affected, especially endangered species like Phragmipedium fishery, some orchids, some species of orchids, birds, some endangered frogs, and mammals like brown-headed spider monkey that is considered one of the most endangered monkey of Ecuador, and the principal and important natural resource, like water. The trends in the region are high, but higher is the desire to conserve this irreplaceable ecosystem and their unique species. We strengthen our conservation work with local institutions and local governments. With the municipality of Tulcan, we have been developing activities to show the Dracula Reserve and invite local people to support the conservation effort. For example, in Chikal and Tulcan, we develop environmental education activities with the INABIO Traveling Museum. INABIO is the National Institution of Biodiversity of Ecuador. Also, we developed a bicycle route from Tulcan to Dracula Reserve, which benefit the communities near the reserve. We continue work with other organizations and groups. For example, Reserva de Jowland Trust, that is conformed by children and young people from the different parts of the world who have supported the conservation of approximately 200 hectares in Dracula Reserve, and we develop some exploration in these areas to know understand the biodiversity. In Manduriaco Reserve, the Biodiversity Group is a friend organization of Rio Manduriaco Reserve that work with conservation in herbs and environmental education with child of the Manduriaco community. Our ranger team work every day to protect our reserves, and these days we continue exploring our reserves to discover and understand their extraordinary biodiversity. We will continue to do our best to conserve this extraordinary biodiversity, especially our incredible orchids. And thanks to all the institutions and organizations that support conserving these incredible reserves.
Thank you, Marco. That was amazing. It's wonderful to get the whole community involved in conservation because that makes such a huge difference. I had one question, which is probably more general in this, because Chuck Ullman asked if the Transcontinental Highway is under construction. My understanding is that goes through Peru, but I'm sure that roads are also a threat to the reserve. So maybe you and Lou could expand on that a little bit in terms of how building new roads and impacts the environment and the conservation. Lou, I need to unmute you. There we go. There we are.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. No, the transatlantic highway is not happening in Ecuador right now. Brazil has, I think, construction going on, but we're okay so far. I don't know what the future of that will be. In general, yeah, roads are always a problem, but in our reserves, we're protected by topography pretty well. Most of our reserves are not going to have roads going through them in the future. Here and there, there's one or two reserves that might have some threats from roads, but it's not a big issue. Roads, the existing roads pose a threat in the sense that that's how squatters and orchid thieves get in. So if there's existing roads, we have to take that into account and patrol them. The Dracula Reserve in particular has a road going right through it, and people do come through there and collect orchids. So we have to keep our eyes on that. But as Marco said, we've done a pretty good job of patrolling and catching orchid thieves in the area.
That's good. There was one question from Bill Loy about what are the temperature ranges of the two reserves?
The two Western reserves, or
He means the Dracula Reserve and the Rio M Reserve. Sorry, I can't pronounce it.
Mandariaku.
Yeah.
The lower elevations of those places are lowland tropical rainforests. Maybe you could call them foothill forests. The lowest part of the Dracula Reserve is 900 meters. So that's very hot, tropical. The highest parts are temperate cloud forest or subtropical cloud forest in the Dracula Reserve, about 2,300 meters. Mandariaku, I think slightly lower, but a similar range of elevations. And then in Baños, we have everything from lowland rainforest in hot tropical temperatures to freezing Paramo grassland. And in fact, the Tigua orchids that I showed you, at night, those leaves freeze. Well, I shouldn't say that they freeze, but everything around them freezes solid every night. My tent walls would be solid ice when I would wake up each morning. So the orchids endure freezing temperatures there.
Okay, and one question from Massimo Ronchi. What is the range of altitude where you've been finding the new species?
The same range that I just mentioned. They're mostly the lowest elevations typically have the least new species. And as our results show what Tom said, it's the mid-elevation cloud forests where we find most of the new species.
Okay, and then Philip asks, how far can orchid seeds disperse in a cloud forest?
Well, let me just answer the first half of that question. How far can orchid seeds disperse? The Galapagos are about 800 or 900 kilometers from the coast of Ecuador, and yet 12 of the 15 Galapagos orchid species are shared with the coast. So there's gene flow over open ocean for hundreds of kilometers, and that's got to be by seeds. Now, possibly birds are taking them, but that's pretty unlikely considering the birds that cross are seabirds usually, and orchids aren't common in seabird habitat. So that's the only question I can answer. The more specific question, how far do they disperse in cloud forests, requires more research and would be really interesting to know. But as I mentioned, you occasionally find huge disjunctions of orchid distributions in the Andes, shockingly large, even of big orchids that people, so that you can't discount it as an observer effect. With Lepanthes, you can always say, they grow everywhere in between as well, and you just didn't see them. It only appears to be a disjunction, but this happens even for Sobralias, which you can't miss. And so I don't know what the limits of distribution are, but they're a lot larger than almost any other plant.
Okay, and then Mark Wilson asked, what are EcoMinga's main fundraising needs right now? Money for reserve expansion, ranger salaries, lawyer fees? What are your priorities?
Thank you, Mark, for that question, and hi. We're actually really good so far about finding funding for orchid habitat conservation, thanks to Orchid Conservation Alliance and our other sponsors. We've almost always we can find money to buy the most urgent areas. The problem is the management, the guards, all the expenses that don't fit well into grant proposals, but that are still constant and equally important. We have in the Baños area, we have 5 guards for 10 reserves. So yeah, we're grossly underfunded for management. So that's what we need, is unrestricted funding for filling these holes in our management budget.
Okay, and then Matthew Scott asks, how much does insect diversity contribute to the places where the different species of orchids grow?
Hi, Matt. Thanks for that question. Well, there's a couple of levels to that question. In an evolutionary sense, the diversity of orchid pollinators, potential orchid pollinators, certainly promotes the diversification of orchids. And so insects must be co-drivers of orchid evolution. And as Tom said, a lot of pollinators, or insect pollinators, have limited ranges, limited dispersal ranges. So that could be one of the things that's restricting orchid distributions. And I think that insect diversity and endemism tracks orchid hotspots. I don't have as much evidence for that as I have for the frogs and trees tracking the orchid hotspots, but I suspect that's true. I'm not sure if I answered your question. But
okay, I think we have one question that I think is really relevant, especially with what Marco was talking about. And that's from Katerina, who asked if you've noticed a change or an increase in interest around conservation topics from the local community since you've first started your activities in Ecuador.
Oh yes, in Ecuador. I'll answer that for my area, and I'll pass off to Marco to answer that for his areas. But in Baños, there's been a tremendous change. When I first got here, practically no one thought of conserving orchids. It was all about taking pretty plants out of the forest and putting them in your yard. That was what you did with orchids. And that was all you did with orchids. And since then, consciousness has risen tremendously. Local people know the diversity of orchids. They care about orchids. They can name you some scientific names of some of the plants in the area now. And they're aware of the importance and the uniqueness of their area. That's the big thing that has changed in Baños, is an awareness of the uniqueness, the global uniqueness of their area. And Marco, maybe you can answer that for the Western slope.
Marco, you're still muted.
Unmute.
Yeah, there. Can you unmute? There you go.
Excuse me. Can you repeat the question, please?
So the question was, in your perspective, how has the appreciation of the local community for conservation changed in recent times?
Difficult, difficult ask this question, but my English is good. But
Yo, Marco, estaba preguntando si la actitud o pensamientos de la gente local han cambiado en los últimos años desde nuestro trabajo en estos sectores. ¿Han cambiado la actitud de la gente?
muy poco, ¿no? A few. The people continue to extract the orchids, especially in Carchi province, because well, I don't know, but it's difficult to say the people now a good attitude, but we need work more. In Manduriaco Reserve, we don't have problem with extraction of orchids. The people is concentrate. It's good in your jobs, but the main problem in Manduriaco is the deforestation. The people extract the madera. Well, is the deforestation, but in Manduriaco no is the orchid no is appreciate. I don't know.
It's interesting the difference between Baños and the western side, and I think that's largely economic. The western side is poorer, has a higher population density, and the eastern side, Baños in particular, Baños lives on ecotourism. Everyone in the town practically makes a living from ecotourism. So people appreciate, they have an alternate economy. It's not strictly an extractivist economy as it is in the West. And they know that people come to Baños to visit the forest and the natural attractions of the area. So, and because of that constant flow of appreciative foreign visitors, they've come to realize that their area really is special. There's none of that in the West, or very little.
Okay, I think we have one more question, and then after this, I didn't get to all the questions, so I would ask people to type in the chat box and directly ask Lou Jost your question, or Marco. So the last question then from Haiti Britton, who asks, are there roads being built for exploration of gold in the, I guess she means in the Amazon basin area? Are there new roads going in there just to look for gold?
Strictly speaking, in the Amazon, not here, no. In Western Ecuador, yes, and there has been, some areas have been completely, some small areas have been completely destroyed by illegal gold miners. When someone hears that somebody found gold in a certain spot, the whole Western countryside mobilizes and people go there and start tearing apart the whole area. So it can be quite disastrous. But gold mining in the Amazon side is very limited. It's mostly washing gold out of sand and rivers and things like that. If you're talking about more of the Amazon than just Ecuador, Peru is being, the rainforests in Peru are being slaughtered by gold mining. I've flown high over Peru and seen from very high elevations, huge areas completely denuded of vegetation. Not a plant in sight, white sand, just bare white sand from gold mining, turning up turning up the sand with dredges and leaving a biological desert behind.
Wow. All right, Ron, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you, Lou. Thank you, Marco, for
Thank you.
great presentations.
Great, thank you very much, Mary. Thanks to Lou and to Marco. We're going to take another 5-minute break. I'll put up a filler slide for a moment. I would point out to everybody that if you have an interest in learning more about some of the reserves that Lou and Marco talked about and that our forthcoming speakers will talk about, some of that information is available through the OCA website and also through websites or blogs that EcoMinga and Salvamontes and so forth have as well. So please feel free to do that and then to reach out to Lou and Marco and others individually if you have follow-up questions. So see everybody again in about 5 minutes.